Shlama Amchun. Please subscribe and turn on notifications for this video. And if you check down in the description, there's a link to my blog post that accompanies this video. I'm going to start using my blog more to put out written information, both for the language and for the information content aspects of this channel. So this posting is about the actual contents of the Peshit Bible, specifically the Old Testament. We'll also get into the New Testament because there's a few areas where that's very interesting. There's never been a Church of the East printing of the scriptures, nor do I think there has been a Syriac Orthodox Bible printed. There have been Bibles that were printed by the United Bible Societies. There's been one that was done by Roman Catholic subgroups, but never one that was actually done by the Church of the East's tradition. And if you were to think of making one, you'd be and you knew the manuscript tradition, you knew the basic sources, you'd hit a wall. And one of the most basic sources for anyone in the Church of the East is the Kitab Marganitha, the Marganitha, the Book of the Pearl by Mar Abdisho. And I'm sure Mar Abdisho would be very surprised to know the role that it has played. On a lot of issues, I think that it plays an outsized role. And one of the reasons is that it's slim and it's been printed a lot, so it's available if you know classical Syriac, and it also was translated into English, although the translation's a little bit incomplete. But in this most common of the editions available, the one by Kasha Yosef Gleta from Mosul in 1924, there's the Mumrad al-Ktawe, which is the Mumra on books. And Mar Abdisho basically catalogs the intellectual library of a Christian of his time. Now, Mar Abdisho, he dies around 1300. He is the Metropolitan of Suwa. He's the Bishop of Suwa, the Metropolitan of Armenia, which means he's the Metropolitan of Nisibis, which means that he has oversight over the main school of Nisibis. He also is the go-to guy for the Patriarch, who's also extremely learned, Martha Matthäus II. He's the go-to guy on canons, and he's kind of a great librarian, a great philosopher, very Aristotelian, and sometimes I think we want to be careful about letting a super Aristotelian not be balanced by someone more like Maraprim and Marnarsai, because sometimes I think that Aristotelian logic can be a little bit too playful, but overall, kind of the man of his age, the man of several centuries, and he comes right before everything's going to be destroyed. So he's got the library as good as it's going to get. He's got the tradition in a pretty high state. He really can represent the Church of the East institution at the level that it's the last time that you'd really want to reference the Church of the East in a particular time as being representative of the Church of the East tradition. And what I mean by that is, if I think of something like 1830, that's not really when I would want to go and take a snapshot of a church and say, this is really the setup for Raza, for a liturgy. Think of the church maybe in the year 300 or 400, it might be a little embryonic. It might not allow for the dust to settle in the birth of the tradition. And if you're looking at about 1300, 1250, although this isn't, it does not mean we have to always live in 1250, 1300, but for a question like what are the books in the Bible, that's a pretty late date, and it's a date that also allows for pretty full libraries, for there not to have been just mass destruction like there would be in the century and a half after Mar Abdisho. So the Mumra, and as you read the Mumra and you're seeing the books that would be in the scripture, I'm looking out for a couple things. One is I want to see the order that he does things in. Number two is I want to be thinking about manuscripts that I've seen that are similar. And number three, I want to see what books does he name. Am I just going to hear a Septuagint? Am I just going to hear a Hebrew Bible? I don't expect either of those because number one, the Peshit is a translation from a Hebrew source, but not the Masoretic source. It represents a tradition that its Hebrew has been lost, and that's the standard scholarship on it. But also, the Septuagint is a different tradition, right? The Septuagint is coming from Alexandria about 200 years before Christ. The Peshit is a Jewish translation made from Hebrew about 100 years before Christ to maybe 100 years after Christ. But let's just get into it before I start answering questions that haven't been brought up yet. So as you read this, and I'm not going to read it in Syriac, you start picking up on some books that aren't always there in English Bibles and some books that are never there. So let's look at them, the books of the Peshit scriptures. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's the Oraita, that's the Torah. We've got that. And then Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And you've got the former prophets. You've got the next set of books. Oh, forgive me. One thing I have to say about this, it's more clear in the blog. So this list, I just took your standard King James Bible list and I added those books that either explicitly or implicitly Mar Abdisho includes. And since this is on video, I just rethought my strategy. Let's actually look at what Mar Abdisho writes and we'll come back to this list, even though I did it the other way around in the blog, and I had reason to do that. So Mar Abdisho writes, Oraita, so Torah, 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then the book of Joshua, son of Nun. After this, Judges and Samuel, and the book of Kings. Notice he doesn't say 1st and 2nd Kings. But then again, the Hebrew tradition remembers one book of Kings. And Abdisho has a tendency to stack as much as he can under one title. So you have Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, the book of Chronicles, Ruth, the Psalms of David, the Proverbs of Solomon, Koheleth, the Song of Songs, Ben Sirah, and the Great Wisdom of Solomon and Job, and Isaiah, Hosea, Joel, and now we're going to get the 12 lesser prophets, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Judith, Esther, Susanna, Ezra, and Lesser Daniel, and the letter of Baruch, and the book of the tradition of the elders, which is Soprat, Michel Maruth Kashishe, and of Josephus the historian, and the history of the sons of Shimoni. So that's the Maccabee story of the lady with her 7 sons. And again the book of Maccabees, and the history of Herod the king, the book of the latter destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of Titus, the book of Joseph and Aseneth, or the book of Asiath, the wife of Joseph the just, the book of Tobit, righteous Israelites. And there he concludes his conception of the Old Testament. And that might have been a really confusing list towards the end. So we'll go through it, and this is going to be one of several videos, because this is a huge topic, and part of it goes into having to reconceive the way we think of Scripture, not because of anything that the Peshit does that's extraordinary, but that there's parts of, I think, the usual way that we think of how the Bible was formed that we have to rethink in order to have space in our kind of conception of Judeo-Christian history, so that this all makes sense. So part of it is kind of, you're trying to expand your horizon of what you're expecting in church history when you're dealing with a text like this. A lot of people, they don't realize that, Moses writes the 5 books, or someone who's preserving the tradition of Moses in the name of Moses, and then you have in Babylon definitely some kind of editing, collation of the Holy Bible, the Old Testament, but that doesn't mean that when books like Maccabees get written, they might not find their way and become accepted as Scripture. And by whom, right? Because by the time that stuff like the Maccabees is happening, you've got already Pharisees, you've got Zadokites from the line of Zadok being removed from the Temple of Jerusalem, you've got Sadducees taking place of the proper Zadokites, and you're getting the mess of the Judaism of the time of Christ, not to mention what's going on in Babylon at this time. As you can tell, there's a lot of history that's going on. Why is it important? It's important because in the midst of this history comes Jesus of Nazareth, and in the proposition of him being Messiah in the next 200 years after his crucifixion, resurrection, ascension, that proposition is going to divide Jewish communities in Babylon and in the Roman Empire, or in Persia and in the Roman Empire. And that division is not a division of Jewish versus Christian at first. It's do they accept Jesus or not. And then also along that, they had a pre-existing geographical separation between Persia, Babylon, and Alexandria, Jerusalem, post-Hellenistic Roman Empire. So, if you think of like the Septuagint people and the Peshit people. So this video, I'm also throwing out a lot of stuff because I think that I hint at a lot of things here, and I kind of have to, because this is a huge ball that I'm trying to pull apart here and have been working on for a while, and even trying to write it down. I just have to kind of start pumping out the stuff because I spent too long trying to get it all down correctly, and it won't work. So this list by Mar Abdisho, it's a great list. But it's got tons of questions. So it's pretty easy for me to say, oh yeah, the Book of Kings. Okay, cool. The Book of Kings, yeah, that he means both books. But you need to know some things to figure out that when he's saying something like Ezra, that also means Nehemiah. That also means Nehemiah. As a part of Ezra, it also probably means the Ezras that are found in Peshit manuscripts. Like Ezra 3, Ezra 4. Right, so it's 1 through 4 Ezra here, plus Nehemiah, which kind of is Ezra 2. But that when he's saying something like the Book of Daniel, that's going to include the Song of the Three Holy Youths. It's going to include Bel and the Dragon. Susanna, why is she separate? Well, that pretty much jumps out at me, going, oh no, she's put with Judith and Esther and Susanna. It's kind of the nucleus of the Ketawat Nishe. But Ruth goes back because Ruth belongs to that first Beth Mutwa, to that first section. And so there's a lot of the stuff that I've had to work out. I'm kind of giving what do they do it before a new film comes out? This is kind of a long, those teasers or whatever they do when they show a new movie, just little bits here and there. So going back, let's look at it at least in the order that we're used to from our King James Bible tradition, our Protestant Bible tradition, and unless you're using a Septuagint or a Dewey Reams, you probably are used to that. Even the SBL goes by that, so I'm going to go by that here. So the Bible, as you would put it into, I guess the way you would shuffle these books into let's say you had someone who wanted to have all the books that were in the Peshita but was used to his KJV order. This is how it would look. I would not want to print it this way, but this is, I think, a less mentally taxing way of looking at it. The Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And then the next section, probably that was actually prepared historically, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. When I say prepared, I mean, at some point these books don't exist. A book like Chronicles, it's a classroom book for preparing someone in the faith. Probably prepared somewhere around 500 BC, but expanding. And that's why a lot of these is 1st and 2nd. So they probably had a point where they kind of stopped, and then the history continued. So like Chronicles ends with the return to Jerusalem, right? Cyrus's decree. So it's kind of a history of the people of the faith all the way through to the return to Jerusalem. And then you have Ezra, Nehemiah, because Protestant Bibles don't just call it Ezra as Jewish ones do and as the Septuagint does. And then 2nd Ezra, 3rd Ezra, 4th Ezra. Actually 3rd and 4th. I don't have to put 2nd there. I'm going to delete that. Esther, 16 chapters, not 10, as I believe is in the KJV. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Ecclesiasticus, Barsira, the Wisdom of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations. So, Mar Abdisho never mentions Lamentations because it's there. And if you look at a lot of Syriac manuscripts, you'll see the book of Lamentations, and in the middle of it, you'll start seeing that those Lamentations become poetically numbered, and you know that you're in the book of Lamentations. That it may be introduced by a line, but usually it's like, you know, you're reading, the book of Jeremiah, and then it just says, and his Lamentations. So remember, that's a printer who determined for you to think of Lamentations as separate. Printing had a lot to do with how you think of the Bible. So if you're looking at a manuscript, you'll see a star after a section, or maybe a double star after a long section. You're not going to see chapters and verses. You know, St. Ephraim didn't know. If you told him John chapter 3, he'd be like, what do you mean chapter 3? Third section? If you quoted in Syriac, you know, a section that begins after a star, so a new section, you gave him the first 3-4 words, he'd probably be able to tell you exactly where that's from. He's memorized the beginning words of every section. Just the way that how we conceive, like in liturgy, we think in page numbers with liturgical books that are printed. But when you're looking at old rubrics, they always reference the first 4 words of the main hymn of that day, because they weren't thinking in very standardized books. They had manuscripts. Sometimes manuscripts that were not always copies of the same manuscript, but different traditions. So same thing with the Peshit. You know, the Peshit is done by about 100, 120 within the proto-Christian or the Jewish community that between Jews and righteous believers in Mesopotamian and Syrian righteous believers who are connected with them. Let's say, you know, people, you know, those who repented with Jonah and those who remained of the exiles from the Syro-Babylonian exile. That community that's united in this, you know, faith in the one God of Abraham. They're preparing this translation. Its core. So, you know, definitely the words in black, a lot of the words in red, they're already prepared, and then it keeps on going until even after the time of Christ's resurrection, because it's not like they instantly all become Christians, right? You know, there's no Christianity as a thing 100 years after Christ. It's a belief in Christ as the Messiah and certain implications, but that separation between Jew and Christian, you know, that takes a couple centuries for it to really manifest. And the further east you go, the longer it takes, because the less the impact of strife between the Jewish community and the Roman Empire is impacting that. Again, you know, tons of tangents, not really tangents, tons of chapters to this story. But so the books of the Peshit scriptures, and then you've got Ezekiel, Daniel, okay, prayer of Azariah. That I'm saying is implied when he says Daniel. Song of Three Holy Children, that's implied. I mean, we sing it liturgically. That's there in the Peshit. Bell, Dragon, they're there in the Peshit. They're there in the best Peshit manuscripts. Judith, Susanna, young Daniel. Now, young Daniel, because Mar Abdisho puts it, I'm going to say that means that it's considered. And he's at Nisibis. It's too late for it not to be. It only exists in like 2 Syriac manuscripts. Brock did a great article on it. I think he hits the nail on the head that in the first couple centuries after Christ, it's the last time that it can be written. I definitely think it's like 100, 120 that it's written. But I think it's a Jewish composition. I think the line in it that Brock sees as being messianic is messianic, but it's messianic because of pre-Talmudic Judaism. That those aspects of Judaism that Christianity picks up on, that you see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance, and this this man of life, this son of God, son of man, messianic language that becomes so intense in things like the Damascus document or the War Scroll, that young Daniel is part of the same spiritual culture rather than necessarily Christian. And my main reason for thinking that is they're either mistaking it as authentically a Jewish book, or they wouldn't put it in the Peshit. Because although the Peshit has a very wide range, the Peshit of Mar Abdisho, he's done a really good job of pretty much having only authentically Jewish pseudo-epigrapha, as Charles Worth would put it, right? So what scholarship would consider not even deuterocanonical, but pseudo-epigraphical, this kind of apocalyptic and additional texts. Those that are in here are solidly on that Jewish pseudo-epigrapha tradition. Young Daniel, like I said, I see the argument, but I'm pretty sure it's going to fit with that. First Baruch, which is the letter of Baruch, we all know. Second Baruch, the Syriac Apocalypse of Baruch. It only shows up in one manuscript, 7A1, but it's the very best Peshit manuscript, especially for the form of the Peshit. I'm certain that Mar Abdisho either saw that manuscript or a daughter manuscript of 7A1. Because 7A1, I believe, by his time was in Egypt. It had moved, but maybe not. But certainly, if they were going to let go of that manuscript, it had gotten copied. And certainly, Mar Abdisho labels some texts, like those titles at the end, that come right off of the headings of 7A1. And 7A1 is from the 600s. So, and it's the biggest, best Peshit manuscript. It's what I like to read for my Old Testament, either on Cal or using Cheriani's. It's actually pretty readable. So the Syriac Apocalypse of Baruch, letter to 9.5 tribes. Hosea. So now we get the 12 lesser prophets. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Yonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Spania, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. 4 books of Maccabees. Now, Mar Abdisho does not say 1 through 4 Maccabees. Mar Abdisho says, again, the book of Maccabees, and again, it's like a comma. The book of Maccabees. How do I know it's 1 through 4? You can make an argument for 2 of them. You can make an argument for 4 of them. Well, number one, what he's calling the Maccabees, so let's go back to where I was. Sorry, I hope I don't give you What he's calling the Maccabees is the history of Herod the king, the book of the latter destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of... What he's calling the book of Joseph the historian is part of the book of the Maccabees, and then the sons of Shmuni, and then the book of Maccabees, which goes into part of Josephus. So Josephus and Maccabees, those titles get flipped. We notice from a couple manuscripts. But in general, it's 1 through 4 Maccabees, and that has to do with these events that he's talking about described in book 6 of Josephus, which is the destruction of the temple. So to cover all that material, and all 4 exist in Syriac, and all 4 show up regularly enough, note that to have a book of Psalms and the 5 books of Moses is one thing. To have a Bible that has everything, it's like a $500,000 item back then, right? Every page is a goat or a lambskin. They're expensive. It's very expensive to have a complete Old Testament. This is a huge book, extremely expensive. You have to pay a scribe for a couple of years to write it. You have to probably be paying a group of guys for a couple of years to be preparing all those tanned hides. So it's not like today where we can easily, we could have an Old Testament printed in Syriac, like $40 off of Lulu. No, this is like a $500,000 book to have all these in one volume, which is why there aren't many of them, which is why 7A1 is so important. They're just not that many of them. But going back to the point I was making, when you're coming over here to this list, that's how I know it's 4 Maccabees. All 4 books exist. They show up regularly in the Peshit tradition. I'm not looking at any one book. You can't do that to figure out a textual tradition. You say, basically, in the stream of the Peshit, what books are existing? What books would you say exist in the Peshit tradition? I'll give you an example of how you know a book doesn't exist in the Peshit tradition. The Book of Revelation has no Peshit revelation. There is no New Testament that has a revelation that is a Peshit translation. There are translations from the Greek that come because of later academic translations of the Greek New Testament. Those last 5 books in your New Testament, in English or in Greek, they don't exist in the Peshit. That doesn't mean they don't exist in Syriac. That doesn't mean if you buy a United Bible Society's Peshit, they're not going to slap on a later translations version of John, Jude, Revelation. They're going to do that because they're not going to leave you with 22 books. They're going to give you all 27. But that revelation is not part of the Peshit. There's no Peshit manuscript that has it. It's like Peshit manuscripts, 22 book New Testaments, and then those that are translation, let's say in the 700s from Greek, those have 27. Guy wants to print it in England, gonna rip his hair out if he's missing those last 5 books, so he grabs that translation from the Greek and puts it here. Now the opposite is not happening here. We're not grabbing the book of 4 Maccabees from a translation of the Septuagint. There are Syriac translations of the Septuagint. This is 4th Maccabees Peshit edition, right? This is book 6 of Josephus' War. We have that as a Peshit thing. We're not going to go and retranslate any of these from any other language. They all exist, every one of these books, in the Peshit tradition. Therefore, they are part of the Peshit. So, some of them we wouldn't have thought of if Mar Abdisho didn't mention it. Young Daniel, Esyeth, Joseph and Aseneth. But they are. Number one, he mentions them. That authority by itself is very powerful because he's not telling you what he thinks should go in the Bible. He's telling you what exists in the Old Testament. Now, I don't think that these ever were in a complete Bible. I don't think these were ever between two covers, all of these books. But I think that if you went to Syriac and you wanted someone to tell you every book of the Old Testament, all the teachers would know this. That those who studied there would know all these titles. But if you ask someone, to copy down a Bible, hey, I want a Bible, he'd say, how big is your notebook? How many books can you put in there? And, you're probably going to have more black than red of what's here, right? If you said it's unlimited, in my time machine, I've got 4 reams of Amazon paper. Then he'll give you all of this, but he's not going to give you a book of Revelation unless you asked for New Testament. And he goes, "Oh, Greek New Testament? I got Greek New Testament for you, Revelation. I can't give you a Peshit. I can give you a Syriac translation of Greek New Testament, Revelation, but I definitely under Peshit, there's a Peshit, 3rd Maccabees, 4th Maccabees, Esyeth, Tobit, Susanna, Young Daniel, 2nd Baruch." So that's how you know these books belong there. And I'm going to get a lot more into the background history. I got through about half of the things that I touched on in my blog, and I'm going to make another video so I can touch on some of what I think is going on historically, because I'm kind of trying to pair off the blog and the video, and because they're 2 very different ways of trying to channel really complicated information. So thank you. Like if you want to, but subscribe and notifications. God bless. Bye-bye.